Welcome everybody to Crystal Ball 2022. We're kicking off our very popular webinar series from last year, looking ahead again and this year into 2022. Our first webinar in the series is RNG, EVs, and hydrogen. And then our future webinars, we have one scheduled in January on biodiesel and renewable diesel, and February and ethanol. So stay tuned for more information on those. I want to introduce our speakers here before we get started. First, we're going to have Sarah Caswell. She's our policy expert and a senior regulatory consultant. There's been a lot going on the past couple days, as I'm sure you all know, and she's going to fill us in on that. Brad Plima is our senior engineer and consulting manager, RNG, line of business guy. And he is going to do the general overview of RNG and where it's been and where it's going. Kathy Macbeth is going to talk to us about lessons learned from LCFS verification and validation, plus some tips on how to make them smoother for you. Dan Chacha is going to join us then for a talk about electric vehicles and hydrogen, where they are, where they're going. And Karen's going to pop in and out there, giving us some expert advice on RFS. And regulatory markets and how they're doing. So without further ado, I'm going to play a video here that explains that intros EcoEngineers and how we can help you, and then we will get started.
Carbon is the biggest disruptor of the 21st century, and the world as we know it is changing. EcoEngineers can guide you to make the best decisions as you navigate toward your clean energy goals. Our diverse team of carbon analysts, engineers, scientists, auditors, and regulatory specialists are trusted advisors of the clean energy fuel sectors worldwide. Clean energy regulations are a maze. We simplify them with an unbiased approach and fully manage your compliance. Modeling your carbon reduction is complicated. We quantify your emissions with a rigor based in science. Together, we can create markets that will protect and grow your investment. We create sustainable solutions for a better tomorrow. We are EcoEngineers.
Hi, I'm Shashi Menon, the CEO of EcoEngineers. That video you just saw is EcoEngineers in a nutshell. We're a team of consultants, auditors, engineers, and scientists with deep expertise in low-carbon fuels, emerging technologies, and policies that are helping decarbonize the world. We are at the heart of the energy transition. At EcoEngineers, we are laser focused on aiding, assisting, and supporting this transition to a clean energy economy. Through our education programs, our science-based approach to life cycle carbon analysis, through our asset development support, our engagement with policymakers, and through our compliance management and auditing teams, we provide a 360 approach to usher in the clean energy transition. The ultimate success of low carbon fuel projects and ultimately the future of our planet depends on the successful execution of net zero goals. And that's exactly what our team is here to help you do. Thank you.
All right, now I'd like to introduce Sarah Caswell, who is going to give us a policy update.
Thanks, Lindsay. Well, this has been quite a week. At this stage of renewable fuel development, RNG, EV, and hydrogen growth depend on robust policy and regulatory programs. To the extent possible, these programs should be streamlined with one another to help facilitate the growth needed to contribute to the massive emissions reductions, which will be necessary to achieve the mid-century US and international decarbonization goals. Today's webinar will focus on how RNG, EVs, and hydrogen are expected to develop in 2022, including with the help of policy and regulatory actions. While I could spend the next 90 minutes discussing the policy and regulatory developments from just this week alone, I only have 10 minutes. So my goal here is to just highlight some of the most significant policy and regulatory developments of late that RNG, EV, and hydrogen stakeholders need to know about. There's just not time here to get into a detailed discussion, but if you would like to discuss any of the items I mentioned below or any policy or regulatory items related to these sectors, please don't hesitate to contact me directly. So just to recap, in the last 48 hours, the California Air Resources Board had a 3.5-hour call to discuss staff proposals for the low carbon fuel standards scoping plan update, which will go into effect as early as January 1st, 2024. EPA released pre-publication proposals for the RVOs and to deny over 60 outstanding small refiner exemption petitions. And yesterday, the president signed executive orders directing federal agencies to stop buying gasoline and diesel-powered vehicles by 2035, to power all buildings with 100% renewable electricity to reduce the government's greenhouse gas emissions by 65% by 2030, and to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. As I said, it's been a week, so just let's dive in. Before getting into any of the policy update specifics, I do want to just state the importance. It's just vital that all stakeholders here know and act upon the significant near-term opportunities right now provided by the regulators to communicate and advocate how you believe final rules to set the RVOs and the substantive changes to the California LCFS program should look. Regulators are much more likely to be aware of desired rule changes by industry and the impacts that they might have if they hear from the stakeholders, from the industry itself. If regulators don't receive feedback from impacted sectors, they're just less likely to be fully aware of and prioritize an issue stakeholders may deem critical. As everyone has likely seen by now, on Tuesday, EPA released its proposed RVOs. This was a pre-publication version of the RVOs. It will be officially released when it's published in the Federal Register. I know that Brad and some others on this webinar will go into a lot of the details of the RVOs and what that might mean for these sectors. So I'm just going to give a quick high-level overview of what the proposals basically would do. The proposed RVOs would make retroactive adjustments to the 2020 final rule, which was published in 2019. EPA says this is to account for reduced fuel demand and other factors due to the pandemic. So for 2020, basically, EPA proposes to set the total renewable fuel volume now at retroactively at 17.9 billion gallons instead of the finalized number already, which was 20.09 billion gallons. And what does this mean for the 4 buckets of biofuels included in the RVOs for that year? Basically, it would cut other advanced down to 4.63 billion gallons from the finalized number of 5.09 billion gallons. It would cut cellulosic demand retroactively down to 510 million gallons, down from 590 million gallons that had been finalized. It would maintain the finalized biomass-based diesel number of 2.43 billion gallons, and it would essentially cut the bucket met by conventional ethanol to 12.5 billion gallons, so an effective 2.5 billion gallon cut there. For 2021, EPA would set the total renewable fuel volume at 18.52 billion gallons, which would include 5.2 billion for advanced, 620 million gallons for cellulosic, 2.43 billion for biomass-based diesel, and about 15 for conventional ethanol. And for 2022, there would be some growth. Total renewable fuel volume would be set at 20.77 billion gallons, of which 5.71 billion would be for advanced, 770 million for cellulosic, 2.7 for biomass-based diesel, and 15 billion for ethanol. The main, in terms of industry, biofuels industry feedback, from what I've heard so far, the main arguments against this proposal are from the ethanol industry concerning the retroactive cuts to 2020. So we'll have to just see what their written comments are and the arguments that they make. Other changes included in the proposed rule would concern biointermediates. It would change the definition of agriculture digesters to add the definition produced from renewable biomass. And then in a separate rulemaking, when EPA proposed to deny the over 60 SREs that are still outstanding for 2019 and 2020, that will, a 30-day written comment period will begin for that from the date of the publication in the Federal Register. I do want to say for the RVOs, for the proposed RVOs, stakeholders will have two chances to impact the RVOs through communication. Number one, on January 4th, there's a public hearing scheduled. And if anybody wants to testify at that public hearing, it needs to be done in writing. You need to request to testify in writing by December 20th. Testimony is usually restricted to 2 or 3 minutes, and that's an oral testimony. Written comments are due on the proposed RVOs by February 4th. So those are two chances to impact that final rulemaking. On Tuesday, as I mentioned, CARB had a 3.5-hour call to discuss staff proposals to make substantive changes to the low carbon fuel standard program. They do a scoping plan update every 5 years. And so this is what this is concerning. The timeline for those changes looks like the CARB staff will continue to have informal workshops where they will, on specific topics, where they will ask for public feedback during those workshops, and they've been virtual so far because of the pandemic. CARB staff then accepts written comments on those informal workshops, so there's a chance to impact and make any concerned or desired changes known to the CARB staff at that time as well. The CARB board is expected to meet twice in 2022 to consider the final CARB staff proposed changes to the LCFS program. It's expected that the board will approve, after consideration, the changes towards late 2022, and it's expected that the changes will go into effect January 1st of 2024. CARB staff said on the call on Tuesday that that would be the earliest that the changes would go into effect. Obviously, I can't describe the entire 3.5-hour long call here, but from a high level, the proposed changes from the CARB staff, and these are in draft form now, and they're accepting public feedback on them. Number one, they want to make sure that the changes align with other states and other jurisdictions, low carbon fuel policies, regulations, and laws for harmonization purposes. They're aware of the need to ensure that the implementation of the LCFS continues to drive private investment and attract investment in the growth and development of a diverse array of renewable fuels and energy. They may propose declining post-2030 CI targets, but strengthening pre-2030 targets from what they are today to accelerate the program and accelerate the greenhouse gas emissions reductions. One of the proposals would allow for expanded book and claim accounting beyond what it is now in the RNG space to maybe include low CI hydrogen production that's injected into hydrogen pipelines. In addition, they are proposing changes that would better support electricity storage to promote the EV sector. There's quite a bit of public feedback during the 3.5-hour call to the proposed changes discussed. In the dairy industry, CARB staff heard from both sides of a petition that many of you might be aware of that has been submitted to CARB and asks that the CI numbers for RNG be reevaluated. The argument is from the petitioners that the CI score is overstated. CARB staff then heard a lot of pushback from representatives from the dairy industry, talking about how they believe that the CI score attributed to RNG from agriculture is accurate, and they further reiterated the contributions of RNG toward achievement of CARB's and California's climate change reduction, greenhouse gas reduction goals. In the EV space, some representatives from the EV industry were surprised that CARB staff discussed strengthening investments and the program to stimulate investment of infrastructure to support growth of medium and heavy duty hydrogen vehicles, and not focusing on EV medium and heavy duty vehicles at the same time. CARB remarked that the feedback that they've heard so far from the public concentrated on medium and heavy duty hydrogen vehicles, and they encouraged the EV sector to provide feedback to CARB on the need for the program to support infrastructure that would support the growth of medium and heavy duty EV trucks. I will quickly say that there are two infrastructure bills that have been widely discussed and reported on this fall. One of them has been signed into law. That was on November 15th. That was the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, with a total cost of $1.2 trillion. That concerns investments for roads, bridges, broadband, things like that. But it's important that the industry understand that there's a lot of funding still in there that would promote hydrogen, EVs, and RNG projects. Build Back Better, that is widely being discussed right now. That has passed the House of Representatives. It's being considered in the Senate. As passed in the House, the version that passed the House that's being considered by the Senate and may be voted on late this month would provide a lot of incentives and funding for these three sectors as well. Build Back Better, the House passed version, includes renewable energy incentive extensions and expansions. It also includes new incentives for sustainable aviation fuel, a new Section 45X clean hydrogen production tax credit. It would expand the ITC, the investment tax credit, to include qualified biogas property as eligible property. And it would also include up to $12,500 for electric vehicles. There's more manufacturing incentives for batteries, etc. So again, as I said at the beginning, I could go on for the entirety of this webinar, but I am out of time. And so I will turn it over to my colleague, Brad, to take it from here.
Great, thanks everyone. Is that all, Sarah? You don't have anything else? That's.
I could go on.
Yeah, no, I mean, so much has happened in the last 3 days, and you didn't even get into what's happened earlier in the year and the transition, and there's so much going on.
Next time you need to give me like at least a half an hour.
There you go. All right.
Anyway, well, but as I said, if anybody does want to follow up with me on any specific policies or regulations, I'd be more than happy to talk about it in detail or provide any information. But yes, there's so much that's happened. Lots of executive orders, initiatives. I didn't even talk about the climate smart funding from the USDA expected, things like that. So yeah.
Well, great. No, thanks for
respect the time.
Thanks for sharing. And I think one thing that Sarah and her team, Karen and the regulatory engagement team do really well is helping people with those written comments. And so if you want to participate in the LCFS process or in the RFS providing written comments, that's something that they do very frequently, and they can help advance your interest through there. But we're going to move on and really focus on RNG for the next 15 minutes or so, and going to look back at 2021, what happened, what's going on with pricing, and then we're also going to look forward here of what do we think is going to happen in 2022. This slide is just an overall RNG market summary of the most common markets that we see people selling RNG into. We're going to talk a lot about the RFS and RINs, the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard. We may touch on the Oregon CFP and the British Columbia program, but we're going to focus mostly on RFS and RINs, since that's where many of these projects really end up. We also are going to talk on voluntary markets. There's significant growth in 2021 of the number of entities buying RNG and the number of sectors that are exploring the possibility of buying RNG. So we saw a lot of activity in 2021 in the utility space. Big voluntary market, a buyer. We also saw growth in the corporate world. Fortune 500, Fortune 100 companies buying RNG to meet some ESG or carbon reduction or sustainability goals. And we're seeing significant movement in Canada. One with a Canadian Clean Fuel Standard, the program as a whole could start as early as next December. And then there's also several other utilities in Canada that are purchasing RNG as well. We will touch a little bit on emerging markets, some of the ongoing other states. We know Washington, the state of Washington, has passed an LCFS type program. New Mexico, New York, Minnesota, Massachusetts, many other states are investigating what would an LCFS program look like for their area. And then Dan Chacha is going to touch on the movement of electric vehicles and hydrogen as we go into 2022 here. So just a recap of what happened. This graph here is RIN prices under the RFS over the last 4+ years. And you'll note that overall, it was a very solid year in 2021 for RIN prices, specifically D3 RIN prices. That D3 line is in green there in the middle. And then D5, which RNG also can play into, is the orange line towards the bottom. The gray line is a D6 ethanol RIN. So you can see if we look back at 2019, late 2019, RIN prices were really suffering. Down in the $1 per range. I think they touched maybe 65, 70 cents at one point. And then early 2020, things rebounded and prices stabilized somewhere in the $1.50 range. And then COVID happened, and there was a lot of uncertainty around pricing. But once we got through that, and really once the election happened and into 2021, you can see that the D3 RIN prices have substantially increased in 2021. Right now, as of yesterday, about $3.38 for a D3 RIN. Those hit about as high as $3.50, nearing or at all-time high pricing for RINs. So really good year in 2021 for RFS and RINs. We do, this is with no RVOs. So the pricing increased even though there was not formalized RVOs for 2021. So I think that is a really good sign for the industry for the year and for going forward. So what are we looking at? Just a recap, Sarah mentioned the proposed RVO numbers. Here I focused on the D3 numbers, and you can see the 2020 RVO, proposed RVO, production's already done. It was actually revised downward or proposed to be revised downward from 590 million gallons to 510 million. But if you look at the chart on the right, the industry produced about 405 million D3 RINs in 2020. So essentially what happened is EPA lowered the RVO, but set it to what the industry produced in 2020. If we look into 2021, what happened? Through October 2021, which is what's published on EPA's website, about 409 million D3 RINs have been generated. And if you project that out for the end of 2021, we're looking at about somewhere in the 523 million RIN range for the D3 space. That's a 11% year-over-year growth. So some growth, but not the 30, 40, 50% that maybe some people expected. Could be several factors. What we've seen is a lot of slow projects. There's supply chain issues that have slowed down startup. And we've also seen some projects that were participating in the RFS program over the last year or so leave, and they may have sold into a voluntary market, and that had to be made up. So that gap, even though it's only an 11% growth, it's probably a larger growth on a project and overall RNG production range. But specifically in the RNG, we're only seeing about projecting about an 11% growth in RINs. And if you go back and look at the proposed RVOs for 2021, 620 million gallons or 620 million D3 RINs, it looks like, just at a really first glance, again, we've only had these numbers for about 48 hours, it looks at first glance that the industry may be short RINs, which would, in 2021, which would mean that pricing would continue to stay strong for the rest of the year. And then the proposed number of 770 million, significant growth, 25% year-over-year growth in the RNG D3 space. Those are really pretty good numbers for D3 RINs. You can see there 99.95% of those D3 RINs came from RNG, about 220,000 from cellulosic ethanol. So most of this D3 space is being taken up by RNG, and that growth that is proposed is a good number. Now, I'll caveat that by saying, if the EPA approves an eRIN pathway in 2022, that could wreak a little bit of havoc with that number, depending on how many eRIN electricity EV charging projects would come online. But without any approved eRIN pathway or significant volumes, this looks to be a really favorable number at first glance for D3 RINs, which means going into 2022, on the next slide, we're really optimistic about where pricing will go. But we want to see what the finalized RVOs will look like. As Sarah mentioned, there is an opportunity for the industry to have input on those numbers. And over the last several years, the proposed number, or the final number, has been revised slightly higher than the proposed number. And so the industry comments and all of the input to EPA in this public comment period, it does work, and it is a good process to go through. So what will those finalized numbers look like is something we'll be paying attention to. One thing maybe on a downside of the next year's pricing is the 2022 cellulosic waiver credit, which helps set the minimum or the maximum D3 pricing range. It's likely going to decrease in 2022 as gasoline prices increase, the CWC decreases. So that pricing cap, or theoretical pricing cap, may come down a little bit in 2022, but we don't see that as being a significant contributor. So overall, pretty optimistic for where things will go in 2022, given the RVOs that were just published. I touched on the eRIN pathway. We're going to keep a really close eye on that, and I think Dan's going to talk a little bit more about that here shortly. And then we'll also kind of continue to see what happens after 2023. Are we going to continue this annual RVO setting process? Are politics going to get in the way, and we're going to put that off at various times and then do them in batches like were released Tuesday? We're going to continue to see what the program looks like, but short-term optimism in the RFS in 2022. If we switch over to the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, maybe a little bit of a mixed message there is you can see pricing here over the last 7 years. Pricing was really, really strong in 2020. And then into 2021, we started to see a little bit of downward leaking pricing. And so going from $200 to finding a nice home and a base around that $175, $180 mark, we've seen those credit pricing decrease, hitting a low of about $141 a few weeks ago. That has stabilized, and yesterday was about $153. And we'll touch on, why is that the case? It's really, in our opinion, it's a supply and demand scenario. So on the next slide, you'll see this is data directly published or taken from CARB's website. On a quarter-by-quarter basis, CARB reports how many credits were generated under the LCFS program and how many deficits were generated. And it's really good information. If you haven't checked out their website, all of this information is there. But one thing to note, if you look at the graph on the bar graph towards the bottom, the blue bar are the number of credits generated, and the maroon bar are the number of deficits generated. And so if you notice, in 3 of the last 4 quarters, the credit generation has outpaced deficit generation, which means there's more credits than there are demand for those in that given quarter, and that puts downward pressure on pricing. So you can see in 2018, 2019, when prices really went up from $100 or so to $200 or above $200, the RIN bank had about 10 million excess credits, and that number was started to decrease. And so the people were pulling from the bank, which meant there were more deficits being generated than credits being generated, and that put that pricing up towards that $200 cap. Well, what has happened since then is that credit pricing has started to build that bank up just a little bit, and that data being released is the reason why we feel that the pricing has come down a little bit in the LCFS program. Those 3 of the last 4 quarters, more credits than more deficits being generated. So what we're going to do going into 2022, we see that probably continuing. We're going to see more volatility, in our opinion, in the LCFS than in previous years. But we're really going to be watching that quarterly data release from CARB to see what that looks like. And credit pricing typically moves slightly after those numbers are released. On the next slide, you'll see what's driving that. And so similar, this data graph is directly from CARB, and you can see the number of credits generated by the various fuel types. And so the big one, I think last year in this webinar, we were really pushing that renewable diesel was going to have a big impact on pricing. And you can see over the last year or so, significant additional credits being generated by renewable diesel. Biomethane there in the maroon, also over the last year and a half or so, almost a tripling of the number of credits that were generated from biomethane and RNG projects. We're going to talk about hydrogen, and hydrogen gets a lot of attention. A lot of people are talking about it, but you can see the volume, credit volume produced by hydrogen on that very bottom line is still pretty small. And so hydrogen is a really developing number. Finally, on electricity there in that dashed line in the middle, you can also see significant growth. So 3 things to watch, in our opinion. What are the renewable diesel volumes and credits being generated? Renewable electricity, and how many new low CI RNG pathways are going to find its way into the market in 2022? And then what will those deficits be generated? What will that look like? And so that's what we're going to be looking at as we move forward here. What's our outlook for 2022 on the LCFS? We're going to look at that quarterly data. Will credits continue to outpace deficits? Well, like I said, we'll be watching those volumes going into California, and we're going to see what is that public comment and workshop. That's going to go through 2022 most likely. And if you're looking to expand CCS potential or beef cattle manure, poultry litter, if you want to get additional pathways and avoided methane emissions into that, now's the time to be engaging with CARB through this public comment period. The other thing to watch, and Sarah touched on this, is will CARB increase the 2030 goals? There's a lot of thought that in the industry that if the credits continue to outpace deficits, which is really good for the LCFS program, not good for the producers, but good for the program, it means the program is meeting its goals faster than anticipated or could meet its goals. Will CARB change those rules? that's something that we're going to be looking and watching. But we do see some pricing volatility potentially happening as we go into 2022. So with that, I think that's the last thing to cover in the LCFS overview and outlook. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kathy Macbeth, who had a really interesting year shepherding many pathways through the LCFS verification program. She's done a lot of validation work as well. So she's going to talk to you about what were some of the lessons learned in that verification validation process that we observed here at EcoEngineers. Kathy?
Yeah, hey, thanks, Brad, for the handoff and for a very positive look into 2022. As Brad mentioned, my topic today is LCFS verification. And before we look forward to 2022 and those lessons learned, we're going to take a little pause here and take a look back at 2021. Verification was the final leg of the 3.0 LCFS rulemaking update of 2019, where all 2.0 pathways were required to be updated to the 3.0 version with the new calculator. 2020 was the implementation of validation requirement, and 2021 was the implementation of the verification requirement. And all producers must now obtain pathway validation and annual verification from third-party verification bodies. The first annual fuel pathway report submitted by producers, and the annual fuel pathway report is a new report, is due every year by March 31st, starting in 2021, and the first verification reports were due August 31st of 2021. Verification, in and of itself has three parts. And I think of it this way: you've got fuel production, or your CI, you've got credit generation, and you've got regulatory compliance on both sides of that transaction. Again, one way to think of it is as a overall financial reconciliation of your fuel production or the CI score against your credit generation and a program compliance audit, all rolled into one event that occurs every year between April 1st and August 31st. There's a lot of moving parts here. So what has our experience been since 2019? On the EcoEngineers consulting side of the business, our LCA team, led by Dr. Zhao Long, has completed about 153.0 pathway applications that have been submitted. And on the verification side of EcoEngineers, 70 validation statements issued and 78 verification statements issued by our team of 19 accredited verifiers. Let's take a high-level walk through the process. Starting with the first step is submitting your LCFS pathway application or your CI application. This application is the basis for validation, and so the more detailed and documented the application, the smoother your validation, you can expect your validation to go, including having a well-documented, detailed and documented compliance monitoring plan, which is also a new requirement as a part of the 3.0 rule update. You'll have, once you submit your pathway application, you'll have 6 months from submission to complete your validation, and please expect it to take at a minimum 4 months, and usually up to the full 6 months if it's a tier 2 application. Once you've submitted your pathway application, it will be validated. The validation of your pathway application is a one-time requirement, and you will contract with the verification body. The executive officer at CARB will approve that association, and once that approval occurs, the verification body will download your pathway application and calculator for review. They will perform a site visit, and once all the issues and findings are resolved, a validation statement will be issued within 6 months. There's always an option, if you're running short on that 6 months, that you can resubmit your pathway application and start that 6-month time window over again to allow more time if needed. Next step is going on to the CI certification. Once the pathway is deemed complete, the credit generation can occur. Now we're moving into really the key features of the verification phase, and the two important pieces here is the quarterly fuel transaction reports and the annual fuel pathway report. The quarterly fuel transaction report, this is not new. You've all been doing it if you're generating credits. However, it is now subject to annual verification. So again, once the verification body has been approved by the executive officer, they'll download those reports. They will request from you your compliance monitoring plan, which should document all of your standard operating procedures around credit generation. They will perform a physical site visit, and they will also then document issues, a log of issues and findings. Same thing on the production side. On the annual field pathway report, this is a new report. Again, I can't say it often enough. It's due March 31st of every year. It documents all your field production activities and the inputs to your CI. Once again, once the executive officer approves, the verification body will download the report that you have submitted. They will request your compliance monitoring plan. They will perform a physical site visit, meaning they will go to the injection point, the upgrading point. They will visit multiple farms. There are multiple feedstock providers to the pathway, in addition to also going to where the credit generation is occurring. Once the findings, the log of issues and the findings are resolved, the verification body will prepare and submit a verification statement and report to CARB by on or before August 31st. So that kind of wraps us up there. A few takeaways on this process. Start on your annual fuel pathway report now. Update and prepare your compliance monitoring plan. Make sure it's up to date. It's meant to be a living document capturing, the day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month, quarter-to-quarter changes in your operations. Get your data and your documents organized and ready to hand off to the verification body, and get your team verification ready. Let them know what to expect when the verifiers show up in your offices or out in the field and on your sites, as well as your operators and your farm and any other partners you have in the process. If EcoEngineers is not your verification body, there are several ways we can help get you verification ready. We have tools, training, and templates. We can prepare your annual field pathway report for you and submit it. And we can help you develop and or review your compliance monitoring plan to make sure it's as detailed as possible. That will help, again, your validation and or verification go much smoother. Here is just a summary table that shows you all of the reports that are due, the name of the reports, where they're to be submitted, the frequency of those reports, of who the responsible party is, and you'll just note on the bottom, those two in orange are the two new reports that are part of the 3.0 update. Now we can take a little look forward to 2022. We have lessons learned to help you have a merrier verification in the new year. And I've got some top tips for verification readiness from our eco experts. And we'll just start at the top of these. It's plan, plan, plan. The more planning you do up front, the more successful the project outcome will be. Select your verification body as early as possible and reach out to them to get connected and get a kickoff meeting scheduled if they haven't reached out to you. The conflict of interest assessment and the notice of validation services to the executive officer is required annually. So you will have to update your org chart annually and any other changes in your organization. Do an internal quality check of your annual field pathway report and your quarterly fuel transaction data. Have your LCFS compliance monitoring plan up to date before verification starts. The more detailed, the better. Start your internal data review early and wait to schedule your site visit until the data review has been completed. Raw data review has been the most time consuming in our experience, and internal QA/QC can go a long way in making sure that as the best practice for data. Review the inlet flow data accuracy, review the 15-minute interval, inlet CH4 monitoring data, and check for duplicate records, all helpful. Make sure the AFPR and the QFTR provided to the verification body is consistent or same as the version submitted to CARB. We ran into this last year and it really boogered things up. Not a great experience for anybody. Have your unredacted invoices and contracts readily available for the verification body. Have your tier 1 or 2 calculator data submittal up to date with the most recent 24 months of data if you have it. And for the quarterly fuel transaction verification, just be aware that the site visit will be where the central storage location is for LCFS transactions. So again, you can expect there may be sometimes 2 site visits occurring during the verification process. Having good relationships with all the parties in the process, the farm, the operators, consultants, including the regulators is key to having a good verification. Your CEI score may change, and this is just a note again of best practice, your CI score may change significantly, so it's a good practice to hold back some credits on account in case you need them. Virtual site visits this year will be on a case-by-case basis only and dependent on federal, state, and company COVID restrictions, travel policies. If you are going to require and get or seek approval for a virtual site visit through validation or verification, please notify your verification body as early as possible. Now we'll move on to LCFS Annual Fuel Pathway Report Readiness. There's a few tips that we have here from our very own Dr. Z. Start with an experienced LCA consultant if you don't have one in-house. Start early for data collection, especially for the information related to baseline manure management, which doesn't require the AD or the upgrading unit being operational. Prepare baseline and project manure management documents that could help the validation or verifier process, which may include previous documents under the cap and trade livestock offset protocol, third-party baseline evaluation report, affidavits from the farmers, measurement protocol and measurement records for user-defined inputs, confirm measuring equipment are in place for all necessary parameters. You can do a pre-construction design review for this to ensure that's happening ahead of putting metering in place or construction in the ground. Collect quality data, set up a robust and reliable data substitution method and apply it where there is missing data that's critical. We ran into that quite a bit in 2021. Provide clear guidance in the application package to CARB and the third-party verifier so they can easily navigate through the documents submitted and help to, to avoid any delays in the process of the verification. That is a lot to cover. Again, there's a lot of moving parts here. If you have questions, please reach out. If we can help in any way, please reach out. Otherwise, thanks so much for listening. And I'm going to hand this off to my colleague, Dan, for a very exciting presentation around EV and hydrogen markets. Dan?
Great, thank you very much, Kathy. A lot of information there. So we'll switch gears a little bit here to EV and hydrogen markets. I'd like to start off by taking a look at the big picture of what's going on a global level. So with electric vehicles in all the major regions with an EV presence, vehicle sales are back to a very strong growth rate. There were a few flat quarters in late 2020 due to the COVID disruption, supply chain issues. Those have mostly been kind of worked out in terms of being able to provide vehicles and being able to move vehicles to market. Worldwide, we're on pace for 6.85 million EVs sold in 2021. That's a big, significant number. And that makes up 8.5% of all new vehicle sales. To put it another way, that's 1 out of every 12 cars sold have been electric vehicles in this year. This includes both plug-in hybrids and full battery electric models. Globally, there are 16 million EVs in service. That's the accumulation of all the sales over the previous recent years. Europe is leading the way in terms of the percentage of vehicle sales sold. So they have very progressive regulations and strong incentives. In Norway, for example, last year in 2020, they became the first country to have more EVs sold than traditional combustion vehicles. So they are really leading in terms of market penetration there. Infrastructure is being addressed as well. In Europe, they have some of the strongest mandatory requirements for EV charging. The latest Energy Performance Building Directive mandates 1 out of every 3 spaces to be EV ready. And then on an absolute number, China is leading in terms of vehicles sold with 3.45 million in 2021. Again, these are forecasted for end of year, but these are the pace that we're on. Switching over to the US market. Here in the US, we're lagging a bit in terms of market penetration compared to Europe and China, but the growth is still quite impressive. Out of all new cars sold in 2020 last year, the rate was about 2%, just over 2% of the vehicles were EVs. And that was pretty flat compared to 2018 and 2019. There wasn't much of a growth rate, but now we've jumped in 2021. We've practically doubled that to a little bit over 4% of the vehicles sold are EVs. Of course, that trend varies a lot depending where you are in the country. The coastal states, and in particular California, are kind of leading those numbers and pushing those numbers. The chart here shows the year to date through October, but we're on pace in the US for 675,000 units this year. So COVID effects aside, the trend is clear. We're seeing strong and consistent growth here as we move into from 20 to 21 and into the future years. The anticipated market penetration by mid-decade is about 10% in the US, and at that point, electricity will no longer be really a niche fuel. It will have emerged as a major fuel source. The next 15 years are really going to be transformative in transportation. Currently, we see electric plug-in vehicles across nearly all segments. So there are light-duty vehicles, there are pickup trucks now emerging, and a particular interest is medium and heavy-duty class vehicles such as buses and box trucks and off-road equipment, forklifts. Electrification is happening across the spectrum. Moving across that timeline, the OEMs are making really massive investments in R&D right now, and this will come to fruition in the next couple of years. We're going to see hundreds of models across all of the manufacturers get introduced, and the choices and the price points will be really a wide spectrum available for consumers. OEMs are expecting about a quarter of their sales to be electric by mid-decade and half of their sales to be electric by the end of this decade. Potentially close to all of their sales they're looking at in 2035 as being electric. Regulations are moving as well. They're consistently getting more progressive in favor of electrification, including mandates on emissions with the goal of reaching zero emissions in the transportation sector. And the charging incentives are pushing, and mandates are going along with those incentives as well. And on the technology front, I won't get too much into that, but technology is always marching forward and makes all of this happen in terms of what is possible in this sector. And there have been major improvements in the battery density over the last few years. The cost of a kilowatt hour in a battery has dropped 80% this decade, in the past decade, and the trend's expected to continue to the point where we will potentially see cost parity with the gasoline and diesel vehicles by the middle of this decade. So that's only a couple of years away, possibly cost parity. And then kind of on the longer horizon are autonomous vehicles. We are seeing these vehicles start to appear in a limited basis in our society, but in kind of a long term, we're expecting to see that be a major force in how transportation, goods and services and people move around. Now that I've provided kind of a glimpse in terms of the market, I'd like to talk a bit about how electric vehicles are going to be looking with the two most prominent programs that we've been talking about in this webinar, the renewable fuel standard at the national level and the low carbon fuel standard in California. As Brad mentioned, there's a lot of talk about the potential for eRINs or electric vehicle related RINs to be approved by the EPA, and our very own Karen Jones works very closely with the EPA and has been monitoring this program. So Karen, I'd like to get you in the conversation here if you could provide us with the latest information on eRINs and the RFS pathways for electric vehicles.
Great, thanks Dan. Yeah, as you have up here on the screen, there are two pathways which are published in the regulations and available for use. However, EPA has yet to approve any electric vehicle pathways under the program. We know that there is a critical mass of projects that have been submitted to EPA. They've gone through the whole third-party engineer and registration process. They've submitted their applications. They've even submitted very detailed procedures on how they're going to address any compliance concerns that EPA has about the pathway. So there are many projects that are just sitting there ready and waiting for when EPA feels comfortable enough to move forward and start approving. I know that there's a lot of people out there have positive outlook for 2022, and that EPA, we are very hopeful that EPA will start to move on those projects. So if you have an electric vehicle project that you would like to submit, we certainly recommend that you do so. But I think addressing those compliance concerns is critical. EPA has put out in some proposed rulemakings, the regs proposed in rulemaking most recently in 2016, detailed out their concerns around the electric vehicle pathway. They really feel like there are some issues with double counting between, whether it is the utility who claims the RINs, whether it is the electric vehicle manufacturers or the charging stations. And EPA doesn't like to pick winners versus losers in that. So the name of the game right now is, if you have a methodology that can allow as much participation as possible, but alleviate concerns against double counting, is what is being submitted. So if you need help with that, give me a call. Thanks,
Great.
Dan.
Thanks, Karen. As Karen mentioned, electric vehicles are not yet participating in the renewable fuel standard, but once the EPA approves eRIN projects, if they approve them, we expect to see the number of eRIN credits to dramatically increase the number of RINs that are generated under the RFS from cellulosic fuels. So this is a hypothetical chart here provided by the American Biogas Council as to what 2020 would have looked like if eRINs were available. Essentially, the yellow bar represent potential eRINs in the supply of RINs that would be generated through electric pathway. And what this suggests is that the number of RINs generated could be about double what it was last year. So 500 million RINs generated. How would that volume, that 500 million eRINs, look in terms of market potential? If we had 500 million eRINs produced in the electric, and also this would include hydrogen vehicles, it would translate to somewhere between 750 million and $1.5 billion of potential revenue, and that range depends on the mix of feedstocks. The feedstock will determine whether the RINs are classified as D5s or D3 RINs, and what the value of those RINs would be going into an electric vehicle. If we take this a step further, using a very conservative conversion rate that the EPA currently uses for electric vehicles, we can calculate that this equates to somewhere between 2 and 4.5 cents per mile driven in an EV. So the result is that we would see a lot of increased investment in activity in renewable electricity and electric vehicle adoption with this kind of infusion. If we switch gears a minute now to the California LCFS program, I'm sure you're probably all aware that the program is driven by the carbon intensity of a fuel pathway. And by driven, I mean the revenue potential. And what dictates that value and that revenue potential is reducing that carbon intensity on a pathway for a given MMBtu of fuel. So the more credits are generated, generally electric and hydrogen vehicles that are using a CI score of 0 or negative CI scores will be most in demand in the program. Current pathways that have been approved range from about -120 for hydrogen up to +80, and for electricity about -230 up to 40, +40. So there's quite a range there, and those with the lowest scores will of course be the more sought after fuel sources for electricity. If we look at recent trends in the credit generation under LCFS for electric vehicles, you can see the last 5 years here. There was a small drop in the light duty space, that's the orange color, last year due to the reduced passenger miles driven under COVID. But the trend here is looking like, heavy duty, medium duty remains strong. And the trend is we're expecting about 3.5 million credits generated in these pathways in 2021 and continuing to increase at this rate going forward. Electricity is a unique animal in the sense that the fuel moves around on wires, and as opposed to being a physical fuel that moves around, electricity generated in one location can be used and consumed in a vehicle in another location under these programs. And that's called a book and claim process. So electricity generated in the WEC region, which is shown here in the beige color, or orange to beige, can be generated anywhere in that region and consumed in California to generate those LCFS credits. But also that concept extends to the renewable fuel standard with ERINs, if those are approved. Energy generated here in Canada could be consumed in the lower 48 states through a booking claim process. It would have to remain in those electric regions shown there. So orange generation down to orange state, and blue and aqua and down to those states as well. And of course, the feedstock that generates those electricity would determine the decode available and what the value of those RINs would be. So I want to kind of wrap up here on the electric side to summarize the sort of the challenges that we're seeing. There have been significant supply chain challenges for electric vehicles over the last 18 months or so. There's a particular strain with the electrical components as well as some of the battery materials. As COVID recedes, we expect to hopefully see those supply chains get restored fairly quickly, and we're already seeing signs of life there. In the hydrogen space, the challenge is getting green or low carbon intensity hydrogen. That fuel is limited right now, and the cost in general of producing the hydrogen is still quite high. So as advancements are made in those areas to overcome those hurdles, hydrogen will expand as well. Generally, the picture is very positive on both of these fuels. We are seeing a massive amount of investment in R&D by OEMs. We're seeing a lot of public funding, as Sarah mentioned earlier on the electric side, with some of the recent changes coming from the federal level, the Build Back Better program and other programs. Infrastructure is also not being left out of this. It's being heavily funded as well, so that we will alleviate any kind of range anxiety and other issues with charging. Generally, regulations are pushing for zero emission vehicles, so that will continue to really push electric and hydrogen. And we're seeing lots of models emerge in both of these spaces. The challenges are being addressed, and we're seeing a lot of movement in both of these technologies. So with that, I'd like to take a few minutes here to transition to a roundtable discussion, and then we will take some questions. I've noticed a lot of questions coming through on the chat, so keep those coming in, and we'll welcome those. As we transition and bring everyone back to the table here, I'd like to remind our audience that EcoEngineers is in the process of releasing the next version of our LCFS forecast report. You'll see an announcement on that in the coming weeks in your inbox. And we look forward to providing the industry with our supply and demand forecasts and analysis. I'd like to transfer this back to Brad, if you could kick us off with a roundtable discussion.
Sure, yeah, no, thanks, Dan. Good information on EVs and hydrogen. You know, one thing on hydrogen, we get having a lot of conversations around hydrogen, and I think the one thing I always look at is what markets are you going to monetize that? Where are you going to put it? Are you going to transport it? Are you going to put it in a pipeline? And then what markets are you going to monetize it in? And certainly the LCFS program is a good one, but similar to ERINs, I know, Karen, there's a lot of interest in hydrogen pathways for fueling under the RFS, and maybe that's on the table sometime going forward. And Dan mentioned the technology is expensive right now. So you got to overcome some cost issues, some market issues, some transportation issues. But we're having, you know, more hydrogen conversations over the last year than I ever remember. So I think we're probably early stages. I see a lot of head nodding, a lot of early stage development, but it's certainly a trend that we see will continue into 2022. But with that, I just, you know, as Lindsay is going to start looking through questions, if you have any questions or of interest, feel free to type them in the chat box, and Lindsay will get to them here in a few minutes. But as we let her do her work there, a couple of things I just wanted to pose to the group, and maybe the first one specifically to Karen. You know, you've seen a ton of projects over the last year, but 10 years, but really the last year in RNG. And, you know, what are some of the trends that you've seen, you know, from a compliance perspective, from an RFS registration perspective? Do you have any similar lessons learned or tips of what's gone well and what do people need to worry about or improve upon?
Great. Yeah, I could spend a lot of time talking about that, Brad. As you know, maybe just starting with the hydrogen, I do think that's an interesting thing to watch into 2022, because published on the EPA website are 5 pending pathway petitions for hydrogen in use to get RINs. So I wonder if there's going to be more people who submit applications, and if there's a critical mass there, if EPA feels compelled to add hydrogen as a new end use, to the regulation. I think that's great. As far as lessons learned with RNG registrations, I mean, we've just seen the industry really develop, and so many projects are coming online. It's kind of crazy. It's really exciting. But one of the critical things that I tend to see is that the projects tend to get more and more innovative, whether that is the kinds of feedstocks that they're using, how they're transporting the RNG and getting it into the pipeline, into the end user. And we're seeing a lot of different types of structures of projects, which is great. It's great to have innovation, but anytime when you're a trailblazer, the path is going to be more difficult for you, and the risk is much higher. And the last thing that you want is for your project to be built out and for you not to qualify for those credits that you were planning on qualifying for. So, really pay attention to, what are those feedstocks you plan on using? What, how are you transporting that gas? Are there additional complexities that you need to think about from a compliance standpoint? And talk to EPA and talk to CARB. I mean, the more you're in there and representing your project, especially if you're doing something new and different, the better it's going to be, or at least what their reaction is up front before you start to invest a lot of money, and you have an opportunity to maybe pivot and do something different.
I just want to piggyback on that, what you were saying, Karen, just a couple things. When we talk about hydrogen and sort of new projects in hydrogen and the potential under the RFS, I just wanted to, just as a general matter, state that this administration has really focused on the last year, obviously, on climate change as an issue, and it's highlighted and put a lot of effort towards helping to facilitate the growth of the least carbon intensive new projects and to help them overcome any cost issues. One thing that came to mind when you were talking is that, way back in February, the administration actually said that it was targeting low cost hydrogen production as a part of its new climate innovation work group. I think that's being headed by Vice President Harris, I believe. And just there have been several announcements throughout the year related to climate where, hydrogen, EVs, smart ag innovation has been stressed by the administration. And I think that if you see that as a signal to the market in terms of, where the renewable energy market is going in the US and sort of what the administration is focused on, you can kind of get that signal from there.
Yeah, no, both good points, and I think it's a hair early still. We're in the early stages of hydrogen, but definitely a lot of momentum and building up.
But they're definitely trying to lower the cost of production and help from a government perspective. So.
I know it's kind of transitioned over to a voluntary market, and we didn't touch a ton on voluntary market. I'm not sure how much there was to say other than there's a lot more players out there than there were. Pricing seems to be really dependent on volume and timing, although I think voluntary market pricing has increased in 2021 as RIN prices have increased to keep up, and we've seen a lot more interest there. But also, the pricing isn't where, say, D3 RINs are, or even LCFS credits at $140 or even $100 would be. And so there's always that balance of, do you go to these more volatile regulated markets like RINs, LCFS, and others, or do you go into the voluntary market and sell more at a fixed price? And Kathy, I know you've worked on a lot of voluntary market projects, specifically with a lot of different utilities out there. And just curious of, if you want to share what you saw out there in 2021, what are you seeing more of, and what do you expect in 2022 from voluntary markets, specifically in the utility space?
I talked in this segment last year about the natural gas utility sector, and in regards to the energy transition that really kicked off in 2020 when all the major refiners across the U.S. announced zero carbon goals, and the natural gas utility sector rose to the occasion with decarbonization goals as well, and which are mostly driven by corporate America's drive to meet ESG goals. And then in 2021, it did not disappoint. I mean, that momentum's there, and it's gaining traction every year, and I think we'll see more traction this year. For those voluntary offtake contracts, we were looking at $8 to $10, $10 to $12, and then we saw 15 to 20, and I think we've seen a few that have gone up as high as $30 a metric ton, which is really encouraging in that space. But what I observed or engaged with in 2021 was looking at the refinery industry, and they're repositioning their current assets to produce renewables at scale, and that I think they'll get there. They're going to get there over time. It's going to take a little bit. The natural gas utility sector is really heating up the competition for RNG supply, and has some also showing interest in hydrogen in their pipeline, and many are working on trying to innovate that. And then just overall, the entire supply chain around natural gas, from the well field to midstream to natural gas delivery, is looking to push carbon emissions down. And they're doing greenhouse gas baseline emissions reporting and setting up carbon accounting systems. What are some of the individual firms that really jumped in 2021 that we again either engaged with or I was following? Southern companies, Green Tariff, they came forward with Green Tariff in Georgia, and they're investing in RNG and building out RNG projects. Nicor Gas also brought a Green Tariff forward in Illinois, and they're soon going to be investing in RNG. Centerpoint Energy is complying or part of the Natural Gas Innovation Act in Minnesota, and they have not only a Green Tariff, but they've established a carbon accounting framework and a Minnesota GREET model to help encourage RNG project development in the state of Minnesota. Northwest Natural out of Portland, they're coming into compliance with SB 98, which authorized the investment and rate-based return on RNG projects and decarbonization. They've also issued an RFP for RNG to bring it into their system. Southwest Gas, they have two Green Tariffs in Nevada, California, Arizona, and they're working to comply with Senate Bill 154, which again is also authorizing investment in RNG and requiring a 3% displacement of fossil in their system by I think it's 2035. UGI and UGIES, they announced a $1 billion investment deployment of capital into renewables over the next 5 years, and they also announced a JV with Archaea to develop renewable projects, and they're investing in RNG and doing project development as well. And then finally, South Jersey Gas and their JV with Rev LNG, and they're developing RNG dairy projects across the country. So there's a lot of exciting things going on. One Gas and so many others are in the space, and it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out.
No, definitely true, and I think that maybe transitions, and I want to save some time for just general Q&A here, but I want to put everyone on the spot and maybe 20 seconds, capped out at 20 seconds here. Kathy, I know you've been beating the utilities drum that they're going to more and more utilities, and so give me your crystal ball prediction for 2022 and beyond for RNG or electric vehicle or EVs or hydrogen.
Yeah, well, I'm going to keep my money on the natural gas utility sector. I think they're gonna rule the way in RNG, and they're probably gonna own the major amount of RNG supply in the country within the next 10 years.
So that's a bold one. I like it.
I'm going for it. Yeah.
Sarah, what about you? You got any predictions for crystal ball predictions on a policy regulatory side here for 2022?
RVOs will be set. So US federal wise, RVOs will be set. There will be lots of new funding opportunities coming out of the federal agencies, DOE, USDA, and EPA, targeted towards implementing these two infrastructure bills. Lots of money. So I encourage all the viewers to make arrangements to monitor those announcements because it may have a huge impacts positively. I mean, CARB, the scoping plan update probably gets approved by the board and will include, you know, concerns of the industry only to the extent that the industry comments. So contact us and let us help you.
Yeah, that's a good, that's a good way. Yeah. Dan, what about you? You want to go out on any limbs here?
Electric vehicles and battery technology will keep marching forward. We'll expect to see some cost parity by the middle of the decade. I think that's on track, and that's going to really do some interesting things to the market. I also think your comment earlier about where the fuels get used, there's more of a merging of building energy and mobility, and that's really, really interesting as well. Generation on top of a building going into a vehicle, and possibly energy from a vehicle going to a building. So there's a lot of overlap in these industries, and they're all moving ahead at quite a pace.
I have to add, the ERIN pathway either gets finalized or is very close to getting finalized by the end of the next year.
There you go. All right. A lot of people probably want to hold you to that, Sarah.
Well, that's what we keep hearing. So, I mean, but it will be done in a separate rulemaking, obviously, apart from the RVOs. And then the set rule will be out at the end of next year. So much happening.
Dan, I do think, you know, you brought up a good point. Sometimes we hear RNG and electric vehicles, hydrogen, all competing. And I think maybe that does happen in some cases, but really, I think we see them as complementary, which is why we put them together, you know, in this discussion. And the book and claim ability, similar trends, and I think we're optimistic just that all three of these can work together and as we move forward here. But just to round out, Karen, you want to say any? Do you have any predictions or?
Yeah, I think RNG projects are going to come online. RNG projects are going to continue to encounter feedstock issues, but then you always have the voluntary market to go to. So I'm with Kathy on the voluntary market and the huge opportunity there. And I think EPA is going to approve some of those hydrogen pathways. How about you, Brad? What do you think?
Yeah, you guys said enough. I think that's good. No, I'm with you. Same thing. I think we've kind of been waiting for this hockey stick growth in RNG from the number of projects to come online. And certainly the growth has been amazing over the last 5 years. My prediction is for 2022, we're going to start to see that big pile of projects coming in to the RFS, coming into the LCFS, and a lot of these low CI dairy projects that we've been tracking for 2-3 years, they just take that long to get built. And so they're now going to register. If you can get your pathway through in a timely fashion with CARB, that's been a challenge here in 2021 as well, but that's going to continue. I think we're going to see a lot of that. And I'll go out on a limb with pricing since nobody else mentioned it. And I think pricing is going to stay relatively strong, especially on the RFS side going forward. Again, in the absence of some ERIN, you know, significant volume of ERINs coming into the market, those numbers look really solid. And LCFS will still see some up and down volatility, but I think that will start to stabilize and we'll find these bands where it's going to stay for a little while. And then CARB will release some data and then it'll go up and down and find a new area, whether that's at $175, $150, or $125. Those are kind of the three areas where we'll be watching. So yeah, that's all good predictions, and we'll revisit here in 2022, and we'll see if anyone see how many people were right, see how many people were not. But I know we kind of went a little bit over, Lindsay, but a few minutes here, 5 minutes or so for just general questions. Are you seeing any trends or any questions that were interesting that you want to pose to the group?
Yeah, what's great is you guys have answered a lot of these questions with this roundtable discussion, which I think was probably part of the plan. A lot of questions about what do you think the discussions are of extending the LCFS program beyond 2030?
On the call the other day, the CARB staff indicated that they would be continuing the program post 2030. However, the targets would start to be potentially reduced post 2030. The plan is to accelerate CI reductions now through 2030, and so look for proposals and potentially in the final update to strengthen the pre-2030 CI reduction targets under the LCFS.
That's a good point, because if they do move that and extend it to 2030, I think that takes a lot of that supply deficit demand dynamics. It will definitely lessen that pressure, and pricing, I think, will respond in a good way accordingly. And the other thing we didn't really mention is if other LCFS states start happening, the Canadian program, if all of a sudden all of this fuel, wants to go to California because of LCFS credits, and it's going to generate a lot more credits than deficits. That's what we're projecting in the next few years. We'll start to see with these other markets what that does to the overall industry.
On Canada, Quebec just announced yesterday, I believe, that well, there's an ongoing rulemaking comment period in BC and Quebec, and so I just urge people to be aware of that as well, because that could be a potentially new market.
Lots of conversation about E-RINs. A good one just came in. Do you think E-RINs are a long-term threat to RIN prices? Also, why do you think that, what is prompting the excitement over E-RINs right now?
Well, I'll take a stab at pricing, and then maybe Karen, you can talk about if you have something to add. But I think if it's planned out through the RVO process, there's no real threat of pricing, because in theory, what's supposed to happen is if we get to 1 billion RINs or a D3 RINs or 2 billion D3 RINs, that if the RVO is set accordingly and matches what the industry can produce, pricing is going to stay relatively strong. If not, if all of a sudden we didn't, they didn't plan for that and they released all these E-RINs next year at once, or all these pathways at once, there could be some struggle with pricing just because that wasn't accounted for in the overall process. So it really just depends how it's rolled out from an RVO standpoint.
Excitement in terms of the E-RIN pathway getting finalized. I mean, it was in the initial rulemaking back in 2010 when they were implementing the 2007 RFS that was passed in December of 2007, but it hasn't been finalized so far. And here we are 11 years after that implementation rule came out in March of 2010. But in anticipation of the change of administration between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, starting probably around the time of the election, I'm aware that EPA and the administration, the incoming administration, had gotten quite a bit of feedback from industry or pressure to really move forward with the E-RIN pathway. So they've been hearing about it for the last year. They know it's a priority. They know that, they really feel that this needs to be finalized. I think that the White House is supportive of that final action when it comes as well. And so the excitement now is that it's been a year of pressure. Some had thought that the E-RIN pathway was going to be proposed to be finalized within the proposed RVOs that came out earlier this week. It didn't. And so there's that ongoing pressure. Okay, you got the RVOs out. Now what about the E-RIN pathway? So there's a lot of talk and sort of rumors going around, of course, about the E-RIN proposed rule coming out as a separate regulatory action early next year, with the expectation that, obviously there'll be a public comment period, just like there is in other rulemakings, and that, I know that the E-RIN supporters and industry would like to see it finalized by the end of next year so that it could be incorporated into the 2023 RVO numbers that would come out late next year. I do want to mention, I think everybody is aware, but the statutory RVOs end in 2022. The RFS program does not end under the statute, the RFS statute. The RFS program will then be largely set each year in the discretion of the EPA administrator, with some sort of minimal guideposts for setting those volume requirements post 2022. And so in the advanced category and cellulosic, advanced can't be less than what is set for the final 2022 numbers. So that's why it's important on the advanced side, on the D5 category, to that all stakeholders help ensure that the advanced final numbers for 2022 that are set at the most accurate projected production volumes for 2022 and not under projected volumes, right?
Well, really appreciate everyone's attention and excited to talk more. A lot of excitement in RNG in all three of these areas, and certainly we'll continue into 2022. And Lindsay, you want one last time to plug the next couple of webinars here?
Yeah, I was going to do that because we have gotten some RD questions here in the chat. And so if you want to tune back in with us in January, we will be talking biodiesel and renewable diesel and our crystal ball predictions for that looking ahead. You might see some of these same people, but we'll see some new people as well.
Great. Well, thanks everyone. We'll see you later.
Thanks, everybody.
Happy holidays.
Thanks for joining.